What happens when the oil runs out? Rich Gulf countries are being warned the future is bleak unless they diversify and become less reliant on oil. So what are the alternatives, and how is the current blockade on Qatar making things worse? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. The International Monetary Fund has some advice for countries in the Gulf: diversify and diversify fast. The oil that's made many Gulf countries extremely wealthy is not going to last forever. And the IMF's 2017 report is predicting the worst growth rate for the region since the global financial collapse several years ago. Economies in the region have been suffering since oil prices fell dramatically in 2014. Attempts to curb oil production have only slightly raised revenue, and the Gulf Cooperation Council diplomatic crisis that began in June has only made the situation worse. The IMF says Qatar and its blockading neighbours could have trouble finding investors if the crisis continues. But it's not a hopeless situation. The IMF's director for the Middle East says Gulf economies are starting to make necessary changes to counter the effects of low oil prices.
Preparing their economies to the post-oil era is something that is becoming the priority of authorities all over the GCC. And we are seeing government developing diversification strategies and introducing certain number of reforms to allow the economy to be prepared for the post-oil era. And those are important reforms.
So what are some of those important reforms? Well, nearly all of the GCC countries have cut water and energy subsidies for their residents. A GCC-wide value-added tax, or VAT, is meant to be implemented next year. It'll be a 5% tax in most countries. Since the Gulf crisis began, Qatar has been building up its farms to make the country less reliant on costly food imports. And Saudi Arabia has introduced an official plan called the Saudi Vision 2030 to reduce the country's dependence on oil, diversify its economy and develop public service sectors. Let's talk to our guest now. Joining us in London, Jane Kinninmont, Deputy Head and Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House in Cambridge; Khaled Al-Khater, Specialist in Monetary Policy and Political Economy. In London, Cornelia Meyer, Specialist on Oil and Gas. She is CEO of Meyer Resource. Good to have all three of you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us. Khaled Al-Khater, let me start off with you. What was your response to this report by the IMF? As a Qatari and an economist, did it make you sit up and listen and go, goodness me, this is telling me something I don't know?
First of all, the IMF itself doesn't support the GCC country or other country in real reform and diversifying the economy. The IMF focuses on short-term policy and comes to country when they are in need or they are in a recession, like in our case, and ask them to implement austerity measure to lift aid, social aid and other aids, as you mentioned, and impose taxes. Open the financial market to foreign speculator and sell the public sector, but doesn't address the real issue here, the real reform. The economic reform goes hand in hand with political reform. When you sell the public sector to a bunch of corrupted politicians, you create a monopoly on one side and you create an unemployment on the other side. This happened in Egypt. This happened in Russia and continues. The IMF policy actually has been destructive in many regions in the world, in the 80s, in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Asian crisis at the end of the 90s, and continuing, and in Egypt and Tunisia before the the revolution, and now after the revolution, look what's happening in Egypt, even in Greece. So the real reform is you have to address the fundamental issue, the long-term issue of diversifying the production structure. You need to focus. First of all, political reform goes hand in hand with economic reform. You have to build human capital. You have to reform the public sector. You have to reform the private sector. You have to build an industrial base. The GCC countries have been focusing on the supply side of the building of human capital, which means that they are importing universities from well-known universities from overseas. Yes, that's not enough. You have to address the demand side. The development of human capital and the accumulation of human capital is blocked from the demand side, meaning when these graduate, they graduate. There is no shortage of universities, there is no shortage of graduates in the third world country, by the way. The problem is, where do they go after they graduate? They go to an oversaturated public sector that suffers from many kinds of illnesses that's associated with the rentier economy, disguised unemployment, probably corruption, probably low productivity, just a number, just to have unemployment, to secure unemployment, to secure the oil share for that citizen, or goes to a private sector that's closed in the face, blocked in the face of national employment. This is the real issue.
Khaled,
this is the real fundamental issue.
Many issues there and raised many points. Sorry, hold on, just so I can keep a tab on those. But let me just throw one of the points you raised to Jane Kinninmont. I mean, do you think the IMF policy is destructive when it comes to this region and the latest report? And is there anything that made you sit up?
Definitely, there are criticisms of the IMF overestimating the degree to which liberalisation could really bring about any kind of economically fair playing field in context of corruption. So there definitely have been problems. But the relation between the IMF and Gulf countries is really different from countries like Egypt or Tunisia, because the Gulf countries don't need IMF money. So the IMF's value is more technical advice, trying to persuade them. And also, I guess, something that seems like a good review from the IMF is a kind of badge that brings confidence from international investors when they're trying to buy Gulf debt. Ironically, in the case of Saudi Arabia, if anything, the IMF seems to have suggested that the recent rounds of austerity went a little too far, and that fiscal consolidation, i.e. cuts in public sector pay, which were later reversed, dampened growth prospects.
Cornelia May, you don't believe that this is destructive? I mean, what is it that it has raised at the moment? We've seen this sort of report before, but I'm just wondering why it's so alarmist now.
Well, I don't actually think it's alarmist. It just states a few facts. And I totally agree with Jane. It is a different relationship with the Gulf countries. And the IMF can give some degree of confidence. And I think this report comes actually at a very good and crucial time. You may recall that last week there was the Future Investment Initiative, a big conference in Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, talking about the future of the Saudi economy, elaborating on Vision 2030. Madame Lagarde, the head of the IMF, was there. And the whole thing of the vision, and also the new super city they want to construct, is about diversification. I think the Saudis have really realized under the current leadership that they have many young people. 70% of the population are under 30, and they need to find jobs for them. This is why they have this grand Vision 2030. Admittedly, very ambitious, but if you don't shake a country up a bit instead to stretch goal, it won't move. So this is all about diversification. Kuwait has a Vision 2035. Each emirate has their own vision. Oman has its own vision. So these countries are realizing they need to do something. They're addressing it. And a little bit of a push here from the IMF is not bad in reaffirming the leaders, yes, they're on the right track here.
Yes, I think you're right about the push, because, Jane, it seems that these countries have been pretty reluctant to do something about it. Do you think they've been overly reliant on oil? Are they waiting for a rebound when it comes to the cost of oil?
We see with all commodity-dependent countries that they all know that they need to diversify, whether that's away from oil or other minerals that some African countries export. But when things are easy in the short term, again and again, governments all around the world, whether they're democratic or authoritarian, put off reforms that are needed in the long term, but nonetheless have some costs. And one of the issues for the Gulf has been absolutely the concern on the part of leaders that austerity measures, rolling back the state, etc., will have political implications and will lead their citizens to demand more.
And it's quite a bit of work, isn't it, as well?
We are now seeing... I'm sorry?
It's quite a bit of work as well.
Well, it requires more work from everybody, because the era of a guaranteed and usually quite cushy job in the public sector is coming to an end. And if you're a Gulf leader, you need to be asking your citizens to prepare themselves for a very different world of work, where increasingly they will be expected to find jobs in the private sector. And all of this is a difficult ask. We are seeing now in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, young leaders who are saying to their populace that things are going to change. But in some of the other Gulf countries, particularly Kuwait and Oman, it does seem that an older generation of leaders is hoping that this will all be temporary, that oil revenues will go back up and that they don't have to worry about it.
Khaled, how difficult an ask is this when you look at these countries and you see how salaries have been used to keep many of the citizens happy and placated, and this could possibly change, and the way you work could possibly change, and your expectations need to be changed as well? I mean, that is asking a lot. It's a real change of a mindset, isn't it?
Yes, it is a real change of a mindset, but I want just to elaborate, to comment on the IMF has nothing to do with the IMF involvement in the GCC countries is not similar. It is similar in a different cloth. The recipe of McKinsey to Saudi Arabia is exactly the recipe of the standard recipe of the IMF everywhere. Sooner or later, they may have to come and to ask for a loan from the IMF. The Saudi economy is not in good shape. You will see crime rate increasing. You will see the poverty rate increasing. You will see divorce rate is increasing. Same problem. They don't address the real issue. With regard to GCC, the IMF also recommended the GCC country to impose taxes. Lagarde herself says the people have to learn. And she did not say that the people also have to learn about the transparency and to know where are this money going, where are the tax money going. People have to scrutinize public expenditure. This is a right as well. And we remember the old saying that no taxation without representation. The IMF doesn't talk about corruption. The IMF doesn't talk about democratic reform. The IMF doesn't talk about political reform. And there is a fundamental reason, there is a technical reason, and there is a fundamental reason for the failure of diversification for over half a century now of exporting oil. An autocratic rentier state is not, it's against the nature of an autocratic rentier state to diversify, because diversification strips the state from its most essential element of existence. That's the redistribution mechanism.
Okay, Cornelia, what about...
mechanism
sorry, let me just jump in here and bring in Cornelia. What about the difficulties when it comes to diversification, in the sense that when you look at this region, I mean, other than oil, what do you have? What do you have to offer? It's not that easy to come by, is it? Is that one of the key problems behind this?
It's precisely that. It's not that easy to come by. And let's be clear, oil and gas, this is not a labor-intensive industry. Neither is the downstream chemical industry. So one does need, for these millions and millions of young people, one does need to create the jobs. So one needs to go into manufacturing, into agriculture, into tourism, into all the things that really create jobs. And there, it's really important to change also the mindset a bit. As as Jane said, you know, it's no longer the nice, cushy public sector jobs. People need to actually work in the private sector. When I look at Vision 2030, which I think I'm fully supportive of, but too much emphasis throughout the GCC is put on academic education. You don't need 10 million new brain surgeons. You also need people who are carpenters and so on. So I would actually advise them to look at vocational training, look at the Switzerlands, the Germanys, and what they've done with vocational training to get more people into the workforce fast, because we need to do that. Unemployed young men roaming the streets do not make
There's an obsession with diplomas here, isn't it? I mean, often you don't get a job without having a diploma of any sort. And sorry, let me just put this to Jane. When we look at diversification, I mean, you have a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, who diversified into agriculture at great cost. It was a failure, it was a disaster. It cost them billions. How do you balance the research into diversification and what makes it viable?
Diversification is going to have different purposes. So sometimes you're looking to maximise the comparative advantage that your country has in a globally competitive marketplace. And if you're trying to do that, you don't go into agriculture, or at least not into water-intensive crops or dairy farms. But those kinds of developments have got other drivers. So for Saudi Arabia, for Qatar, for other Gulf countries, the driver has been food security. And we're going to see that probably become more important in the light of what's happened recently with the Qatar crisis. You may also be looking to prioritise sectors that create jobs for nationals, even though you might be able to make more money by having sectors that are largely reliant on migrant workers. So there's a lot of things that Gulf countries have to juggle here. But I would say one of the areas where they have historically been really competitive is all the range of sectors that are linked to the Gulf's amazing locations between Europe, Africa and Asia. So you've seen historically, before the discovery of oil, these countries were of vital importance as trading centres and as ports. And today too, we see some of the major investments in the region coming into ports. We see the airports, the airlines, tourism, logistics, all these traditional areas of strength being things that the Gulf can rely on after oil too.
OK, you mentioned food security, and Khalid, that's an important point, isn't it? And Qatar is now addressing it by pumping a lot of money into its farms. We know that because of the crisis, the government has had to subsidise much of the food imports, the food that we're getting in front of us. I mean, how sustainable is that, and how are they able to do that other than tapping into their sovereign wealth fund?
That is sustainable as long as we take the situation, as I said many times before, the golden rule here is to deal with the crisis as if it's an ongoing reality. So we don't relax, we don't sit down. So Qatar has been trying now to diversify its sources and means of import, and also this is the short-term policy response, and the medium-term policy or longer-term policy response is to try to diversify the economy, try to boost the production with whatever we can in to satisfy local, I mean, for in terms of food, agriculture, animal products, manufacturing, building material, as much as we can. If we can like satisfy this locally, and then we can go for an import from overseas. One more thing I want just to elaborate on the diversification issue. I was talking about the rentiers and autocratic rentier state will not support diversification in real term unless by necessity, like we have the experience of East Asian miracle, the countries. These countries, they were, when they started to run out of oil like 3 decades ago, their leadership felt the dangers of the situation, and then that was a source, or like a force to push them to diversify the economy. So the GCC country, in my opinion, when we are sitting on the largest oil reserve in the world, so in the back of our mind that this is an oil cycle. We can sometimes we have boom, sometimes we have bust, and we have a recession. So the reality is different now with the shale oil. This is going to be an ongoing and long-term issue with lower oil prices. So unless we address the real issue here, political and economic reform, we have to reform the private sector to make a competitive private sector, build an industrial base, a private sector that can generate employment for national. And you also, hand in hand, you have to reform the public sector, enhance the productivity in the private sector.
Let me, if I may, bring Cornelia in here.
And leadership in the private, on the public sector, who can have a vision and can design and implement successful policy and can attract the buildup of national human capital into the public sector as well as the private sector.
Cornelia, let me just put this to Cornelia, because we don't have much time left. But I mean, the impact of this standoff, the Gulf diplomatic crisis, it's not just on the countries that are affected, right? I mean, it has a global impact, and the longer it lasts, the more it'll be corrupted and rotten.
Absolutely, and I think, the short-term impact is not that bad. If you look at the monetary flows, if you look at it, it's all been managed. But in the longer term, the world needs a stable GCC in the midst of, all the things going on in the Middle East. It's very important. And for the GCC, it's important to show that stability and also to show reason. When you look at the new NEOM project in this mega city in Saudi Arabia, you want foreign direct investment. In order to attract foreign direct investment, you need to show that leadership is reasonable, that you have long-term, you look at long-term prospects. So really, for the economic welfare of the GCC as a whole, and for the stability of the Middle East and therefore the world, we do need a stable, functioning GCC.
Right, stable, functioning GCC, diversification, obviously, that is key, Jane. How big a factor does Donald Trump play in all of this, considering his America First policy hasn't really played out yet? Is that built into the business plan here?
Many in the Gulf see a long-term trend where the US, it seems to be, in their view, disengaging from the region gradually. And actually that's been common to both the Obama and the Trump presidencies. Obama talked about pivoting to Asia, but did in fact increase defence sales to the Gulf. Trump, meanwhile, has talked about more defence sales, engaging more. He speaks the Gulf's language on Iran, but there's not much sense that he wants to change the posture, and America First does represent quite a big constituency in the US that is not really sure why they have these deployments in the Middle East. I don't think the US is pulling back from the region at all, but that perception is there, and that is partly why we see Gulf leaders courting Russia as well as the Asian states that they are increasingly doing business with.
And Cornelia, I suppose, briefly, if you will, because this is a unique region with its unique problems, there could be unique solutions that could be exciting, right?
Well, there could be unique solutions, and I think they're onto something with all these visions and of diversification. This new mega city, which says, okay, we're a hub between Africa, Europe, and the Middle and Asia. That's very exciting. But like with everything, it's the grand design is great. It's the implementation that we need to look out for, and that may not be so easy. But creating the momentum creates a sense of obligation on part of the leaders to really push ahead with these agendas.
And let's leave it there. Big thanks to my guests, Cornelia Meyer with those final words, Khaled Al-Khater and Jane Kinninmont. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Jay Dutton, and the rest of the team, Goodbye for now. Thanks for watching.